Welcome back to Naval Action. I'm going to be covering the Victory today. Now this is a bit of a love affair for me, so this video will be longer than most people probably might expect from a ship review. What I'll do is I'll stick a couple of tags in at the start of the vid, so if you want to jump just to the game ship review and miss out on the fantastic history, then you can do that easily. HMS Victory was the first of the first rates. The Brits up until then had a doctrine that very much relied on their faster frigates, predominantly because it helped them convoy their trade ships very well, and the frigates had gone well against the French. However, the 7-Year War was going off, and the British at the time commissioned 12 new ships, including the Victory. It was the first of the first rates, the first of the big 100-gun ships, and as a result they had to build a port specifically for it. So construction began in 1758, firstly with the building of the dock itself, and it took a couple of years to build her, and then tragically the 7-Year War ended, which I don't understand. I mean, it's called the 7-Year War. You'd have thought they would have realised it was going to end. Now, it sort of was a bit lucky though for the Victory, because typically after you built the frame of a ship and the keel and the frame, so the if you like the spine and the ribs of the ship, once you'd built those, you would leave the ship for a year for the wood to dry. And with the 7-Year War ending, she ended up sitting in port for a few years, for several years. It wasn't until 1765 that she would sail out of dock. Victory took 6,000 oak trees to build, nearly 100 acres of forests. Her sails, 37 sails, have a greater coverage than a football pitch. Indeed, the cladding on the Victory, you could clad the Empire State Building 1.5 times with the planking on the Victory. Her topmasts would rise 150 feet above her deck, and it's very much these ships that gave us the name skyscraper. When people saw these sailing into port, they felt that their topmast scraped the sky. The ship would cost about £70,000 to build, which is probably about 50 million in today's money, but she cost 6 times that in running costs during her life. And perhaps one of the most amazing things about the Victory is you can still see her today. I'll put a link into the bottom of the vid description as to where you can go and visit her. It's in Portsmouth, England, but yeah, she's still set up in dry dock. Unfortunately for her, she's not like the Connie sitting in water, but she's sitting in dry dock, and you can go and visit her in Portsmouth and walk around. So that's the ship there. That's the bottom cannon deck, bottom gun deck, and you can see that's about 180 feet long. Imagine being in that. That'd be crazy, eh? It's only about 6 foot high, and you can imagine how a raking shot would be a disaster if it came down one side or the other. This is one of the original cannons. When you visit the Victory, you can see the original cannon, and this is one of a dozen original cannons, 250 years old, and this is a good picture to have a look at. Again, I'll provide the link, but you can see these are all different types of chain shot. They would fire different ranges, and we've got some grape shot down here, and this shows you how they would pack the guns. 300 men would live on this deck. They'd sleep here, they'd eat here. On a still day, they could head up to the top deck, and each sailor would be in a mess of 6 to 8 men, and they'd take it in turns to cook. Typically, they'd get 3 meals a day, which would be better than someone would get on land. They might get meat 3 times a week. They would cook perhaps 1 hot meal every second day, taking it in turns to cook it. Breakfast would be molasses mixed with perhaps some oats. They get a nice big pint of rum to keep them slightly inebriated throughout the whole day. And they would probably get better food than if you were living on the land, which is pretty surprising. Now, obviously, the famous battle that Victory was involved in was Trafalgar, but prior to Trafalgar, she saw quite a lot of action. Initially, it was involved with trying to blockade the French. This was pretty much around the time of the French Revolution, leading up to the time of the French Revolution. And there was 2 fairly large engagements off Brest, known as the Battle of Ushant. Now, this was before Nelson was her captain. This was in 1778, and then about 18 months or so later, where 30 ships of the line would closed on each other. However, the weather was kind of terrible, and neither engagement became decisive. The first engagement really got messed up by the weather at Ushant. The second one, the Brits saw a large number of French convoy ships, and although in the second battle there was only 10 British ships of the line, because the French were so dispersed, the Brits managed to capture 15 of the convoy ships and then get out before the French could get in. The next major engagements would be the blockading of Gibraltar and breaking the blockade. At the time, there was a lot of battles for control of the Mediterranean, and the French and their Spanish allies were trying to get control of the Mediterranean, and at the same time the British were obviously trying to get supplies in there. And so on a number of occasions, Victory was used to effectively perform a blockade run. Probably the biggest battle prior to Trafalgar was known as the Battle of St. Vincent. And in that particular case, the British only had about 10 or 12 ships of the line. They saw 10 Spanish ships of the line and headed towards them. However, the count of sails of Spanish ships kept going up, and in fact the commander of the British fleet, Admiral William Parker, told them to stop counting at 27, and he said, our job is to stop these ships joining up with their allies, and no matter how many of them there is, we're going in. And in the end it was sort of 10 Brits versus about 27 Spanish ships. The Brits went in and managed to cut them off to some extent. Here we go, I'm going to get rammed here, this is no good. Managed to cut them off to some extent. Just a second while I don't die. Get too slow. You've always got to be wary of getting too slow in these things. The Brits managed to cut the ships off. Jarvis formed into 2 columns and surprised the dispersed fleet. And indeed, the first ship that Victory opened up on just ended up running from battle. Come on, get your nose down. There we go. You can't complain about that as a broadside, eh? Very important when you're sailing these things to manage your gun decks, because your reload time really does clock up. I even take the time to turn my rears off. So in the battle against the Spanish off St. Vincent, it ended up being a good result for the Brits, and they prevented the Spanish from joining up with the Allies, with the French, and despite being super heavily outnumbered, captured a number of ships and took no significant casualties themselves. Careful you don't drop too slow, otherwise you'll get boarded in these things. Nelson took control of the Victory in May 1803, and Nelson had fought a great deal and was a well-renowned captain at the time, Rear Admiral actually at the time. And it would be Nelson whose job was to face the combined French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar. So one of the questions is, you know, why was Trafalgar so important? Well, the reason is that Napoleon had amassed 120,000 troops at Calais, and he wanted to invade Britain and capture Britain. But he couldn't do it without control of the English Channel. And in fact, it was Napoleon had said to his navy, give me control of the English Channel for 6 hours. That's all I need, 6 hours, and I will give you Britain. So, you know, this Battle of Trafalgar, if it hadn't have gone Britain's way, could well have resulted in the successful ground invasion by Napoleon's forces, and Napoleon at the time had the best standing marching army in Europe. So that would be a terrible situation for Britain to find herself in if she'd been left open to Napoleon's forces. Nothing's penetrated. That's the new penetration mechanics. Bless their cotton socks. That's my speed. The goal then at Trafalgar was to annihilate the opposing fleets. And Villeneuve, who commanded the French, he knew that Nelson was the better commander. Everybody knew Nelson was the better commander. There was no pretense. The French actually had recently had their revolution, and as many of you will know, a lot of the aristocracy literally lost their heads in the revolution, and as a result of that, they'd lost enormous numbers of their elite class, and of course it's the elite class who typically captained and managed the ships. So the French skill set was hugely reduced when it came to managing a ship of the line, and a ship of the line required a huge skill set to do exactly that. It's not about reflexes, it's about being able to plan half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours ahead. These are super complex vessels. And Villeneuve simply didn't have the crew. Not only that, the British crew were famous for their gunnery prowess and their ability to reload their cannons. They could reload their cannons in 90 seconds, and that was often a good 30 seconds faster than their Spanish and French counterparts could manage. And that's an enormous difference when you're talking about firing off broadsides. Nelson knew that he was going to be outnumbered at Trafalgar. In fact, Nelson had spent a long time chasing Villeneuve, whose job initially was to draw Nelson away from the European theatre and then give their allies the chance to take the British standing fleet there, and then in turn be able to launch the invasion fleet. Now, Nelson knew this, he wasn't stupid, and so he followed Villeneuve almost to the West Indies and back, met up with the rest of the British fleet, Villeneuve napped himself and went and docked into Cadiz, which basically gave Nelson the chance to blockade with frigates, leave his larger fleet off the coast, which he did. When Villeneuve came out, he was kind of hoping that the Brits were gone, or that he was only facing a minor fleet, and instead he found himself engaged, as Nelson had wanted, with the entire fleet, the entire British fleet. It was still, however, a huge advantage to the Spanish and French in numbers. It was 27 British ships of the line versus 33 French ships of the line. And Nelson knew that if he got himself into a line battle, the sheer gun force of the Spanish and French fleet would put him at a significant disadvantage, even with his superior gun sailors and his superior marines. So Nelson devised a plan where he wanted to get his troops into what he described as a pell-mell. So that sounds very fancy, being in a pell-mell, but actually a pell-mell means a sort of frantic and chaotic engagement. What Nelson was trying to do was he was trying to get as many ships one-on-one as he possibly could, and in particular he wanted to get the command ships of the opposing fleet captured or sunk in one-on-one engagements, and he was highly confident that if he got himself into these one-on-one engagements, he would come out the better. Now, the problem with that is that you then have to sail towards your opponent's line, which opens up all of your ships to their gunfire. And Nelson knew this, but really had little choice as to the tactic he had to adopt. He initially wanted to run in with 3 lines of ships into the Spanish and French lines, and basically cut them into 3 segments or 4 segments. However, the numbers really didn't allow for that, and as a result, the best he felt he could do was run in 2 lines, and he himself would lead in victory the charge that would cut off the French command ships, and the second line would cut the centre of the Spanish and French lines. So his goal there was to basically leave a third of the French and Spanish fleet set up in such a way that they would have to turn into the wind in order to prosecute the British fleet. And now I have to do the very dangerous thing of turning through the wind. So on the day of the battle, Nelson wanted to signal to his men that England confides that every man will do his duty. His signaller came back to him and explained that they didn't have a flag for the word confides. Confides in this context, incidentally, meant had confidence. But his signalman came back and said, look, if we're going to use the word confidence, the problem we've got here is that I'd have to spell it out letter by letter. How does accepts go? And Nelson said, expects is alright, that'll do, I suppose. And that's how the famous message came out from Nelson prior to the order to move into combat, that England expects every man to do his duty. And thus the order was given to move into battle formation and head in to the battle proper. Now the winds were fair at best, so, and I mean this is frightening. In order to close on the Spanish lines, it took 40 minutes for the two British columns to sail into the French and Spanish line battles. And in those 40 minutes, Victory took the brunt of the force with 5 ships firing on the Victory as she closed to battle, including the Santissima and the French flagship Redoutable, which had Villeneuve himself on. And in that time, Victory lost a lot of sailors. In fact, Victory took the greatest casualty rate of all the ships that were involved in the battle. This is a bit of a pell-mell now itself, isn't it, eh? As Victory closed in, with these 4 ships firing down on her, the Santissima, the Redoutable, the Neptune, she entered the line and basically pierced the line between Bucentaure and the flagship Redoutable. Victory's sails tangled, this is how close they were, tangled with Redoutable, and Bucentaure then, which was very much set up as a boarding ship, prepared to board the Victory. And twice the Brits formed up ready to repel boarders on the deck, but the grenades were being thrown. The French were throwing grenades from both ships, from the Redoutable and the Bucentaure. However, as the Bucentaure set up to board, the second British ship of the line came up alongside her and raked her decks. Now imagine all of her sailors are ready for boarding, they'd all been called off the guns and placed into boarding positions, and the British ship came line on line with her and raked her. And later on, when the ship was captured, one of the Marines noted that there were less than 100 men standing on the ship, the Bucentaure, or whatever it was called, however you pronounce it. 500 dead or injured. So that's what a raking shot could do across a ship that was being prepared for boarding. Victory herself was raking her through the prow, and again one of the Marines that survived the battle reported how one of Victory's big 42-pounders that raked across the prow of the ship had run down the full gun deck and disabled 40 men. So imagine that, one cannonball going the full 150-60 feet of the gun deck and disabling 50 men. It was during this engagement, however, that the French and the Spanish knew that the British enjoyed a good boarding, and they adopted this tactic where they would put shooters, marksmen, into their rigging, into their top decks, and shoot down on the Brits, especially up against the officers, as frowned upon as that was, as a way of reducing their order and their ability to command a full boarding. Alright, buddy, you're out of it, I think. And it was one of these shots that, from the rigging of Redoutable, that pierced Nelson in the shoulder, and the shot carried on down his torso and ended up bursting through one of his lungs and shattering his spine. And Nelson knew as soon as he was hit, he knew he was done. And he was taken down into one of the gun decks where the medical area was quartered off. Famously, Nelson requested that he wait in turn and not get ahead in the triage to be treated. In fact, Nelson knew he was in deep doo-doo. He knew he was dead. And from that point on, it was his first and second captains who very much ran the battle for him, and they really just spent time reporting back to Nelson how the battle was going. It would be 6 hours, the best part of, before Nelson passed away, and he was constantly getting reports. Now, as all this was happening, the battle was going exactly as Nelson had planned. The British had managed to get themselves involved in a large number of one-on-one sorties. It's pell-mell, as Nelson had called it. And as a result, ship after ship from the French and the Spanish were being captured. And the battle was very much turning for the direction of the Brits. Indeed, by the end of the battle, of the 33 ships of the line that had been presented by the Allies, 15 had been captured, and fundamentally the French-Spanish Allied fleet had been shattered. The French and Spanish lost over 4,000 men in 15 ships, whereas the Brits lost about 400 men and not a single ship, although Victory herself was severely damaged and had to be towed back into port. Nelson, of course, famously died below decks. As he was passing away, he made 3 requests. He requested that Britain take in his wife and his adopted daughter and look after them. He asked that his body be not thrown overboard and be taken back for a proper burial. And finally, he asked whether or not, in the eyes of his leadership, did they believe he had done his duty. He knew the importance of his duty. He knew that he had to prevent Napoleon from being able to invade Britain proper. And of course they said they told him that they'd captured 15 ships and broken the fleet. He reputedly bemoaned that it wasn't the 22, which was his plan if the segmentation had gone to plan. And as he slipped away, the famous "Kiss Me Hardy" line was issued, and Hardy kissed him on the cheek, and then later, after he passed away, he actually gave him a second kiss on the forehead, so that's very nice. The Victory was really badly beaten up, and the Admiral in charge recommended that, in fact, it not be Victory who returned to Portsmouth straight away with Nelson's body, but instead that duty be given to another ship. The crew of the Victory just outright refused that request, and as crippled a ship as they were, they demanded the right to carry Nelson's body back to Britain, and they did. And that was pretty much the last major action that Victory herself was involved in. And in 1812 she would sail into Portsmouth for the last time as an active duty ship, and there she would be moored until about 90 years later, when people realised she was falling into terrible disrepair. The death beetle was eating her wood, So as a result, a big restoration exercise was undertaken, which is why you can still see her today in all her splendour. And like I say, you can still see some of the original cannons on the decks of Victory, which I think is just amazing. 250 years old, and really, Victory's the oldest ship of this age that you can still visit. The Constitution, of course, being the second oldest ship that you can visit of this age, and both of those ships were really such important ships for their nations at the various stages of these wars. So now I'll move on to the bit that probably most of you started listening to this waffle for, and that is, well, how does she play in game? Now, I'm reviewing this shortly after the damage mods 5.0 came out, and then the slight tweaks to these mods 5.1 came out, and as a result I'll be describing how she performs with that in mind. I should say I think they've broken the Victory a little bit with what they've done to her armour. I don't think she plays the way I've just described her history, and I don't like that. It makes me sad panda. However, let's have a look at her. So her base build would have an armour of 11,500. Sorry, not armour. A HP of 11,500 and an armour of 80. She used to have an armour of 90. So if you do a live oak build, which is really what you should do, because she's a gun platform, you can get that HP pool up to 13,250, which is huge. It's 2 Connies. And you can get her armour up to 90, which is good. 90 is at 250 meters plus, pretty hard to penetrate. Of course, you sacrifice speed, but this thing's it's never a fast boat. It's in fact the slowest boat in the game. 10.5 knots or something like that on the tin. Good mods for this are golden hammocks, because a lot of the mods work on percentages. On these first raters, if you can get a mod that gives a 10 or 12%, obviously if you're running with 800 odd crew, then that 10 and 12% is a huge boost. So I'd strongly recommend going with those bigger mods and taking full advantage of her advantages. So things like planking, extra planking, although that will slow her down more. 3% of 10.5 isn't really very much, but the big increase in HP, an extra 1400 HP, is really significant. So I'm a big fan of trying to bloat the advantages of a ship and not worrying too much about the weaknesses. So golden hammocks is a great mod to put on there, and in fact if you put golden hammocks on, you can crew the Vic, fully crew, almost, bar one crew member, the Vic. So if you're a Commodore, you'll be able to get 859 crew. She needs 860 crew, so you know that's close enough, isn't it? I personally would only undercrew her in missions. I'd never undercrew her in combat. I think that would be terrible folly. Let's just see where everybody is in this thing. I think that would be terrible folly. So she's fine for doing your fleet missions like this. These are great fun in a Victory, but don't undercrew her in PvP, because the Santies with capping mods will just see you as a bit of a free kick, to be honest. I would, so hammocks, extra planking, powder monkeys and access magazines to get your reload speed up as fast as you can. Of course, powder monkeys is a bit of a Christmas RNG drop, but they're really handy. And then I suppose if you want to, you can go with some boarding mods. The problem I find is with boarding with the Victory, because she runs really at a bare minimum crew. When she fought in Trafalgar, actually, there was 830 crew on board, so technically she was undermanned. But with taking crew injuries quite a lot in the current patches, you have to be quite wary of running close to the line with crews. I mean, I'm managing my guns reasonably well here, but you can leave yourself short pretty quickly if you're not careful. But if you do use it for capping in PvP, you know, capping a first rate will net you 300,000 gold, so that's pretty handy. Her guns give you approximately 25% more firepower than, say, the Pavel, but it is 10% less than the Santee, and that really is the problem for the Victory right now. The Victory, before the latest damage patch, fundamentally the Santee had the firepower, so the Santee was the spank and the Victory was the tank. But now what they've done is they've made the armour on the two ships practically the same. It's 78 on the Santee and 80 on the Victory, so it's, you know, it's practically the same armour. And as a result, the tankiness of Victory has been somewhat reduced. If you look across the gun decks, so if we start at the bottom and work our way up, the bottom gun deck on the Victory, on one broadside she has 32 guns, one broadside she has 16 42-pounders. Now they'll penetrate anything at 750 yards, meters, whatever the unit of measure is. The Santee has an extra gun there. The next deck is on one broadside 15, so 30 cannons in total, 15 24-pounders. Now that will pen anything at about 500 meters, assuming you've got a perpendicular penetration. The next deck, sadly, is only 12-pounders. Now that's true of the Santee as well, but the Santee has 3 more of those. They'll pen at about 250. They'll pen most things at about 250. The top deck only has 7 guns, the weather deck if you like, so up here only has 7 guns on each side. This is where the Santee has the huge advantage. The Santee has 17 guns on each side, so 34 guns in total. Now again, they're 12-pounders, but you can mount the 42-pound carronades. What I do a lot actually is I'll turn off my top 2 decks and only fire with the bottom decks at range, so that I'm not paying the reload time if I have to on those 2 decks, and then I'll only use these 2 decks, these top 2 decks, for shooting close range, or perhaps using them to shoot at sails with. So that's the nub of it with the gunnery. Now she is a ship of the line, and although she looks magnificent, a beautiful sort of black and yellow stripe, this fantastic, I mean this looks like a cruise ship, on the back. Although she looks beautiful, if you're sailing this alone, the technical word for that is you're an idiot, because a Constitution in the right hands can stern camp you, and they will take your bottom off, and then they will rake you for half a dozen passes, and as a result you'll lose your Victory. So never sail a ship of the line on its own, even in what you think is short, safe waters. Always have a buddy. It's like crossing the road. Hold someone's hands, look both ways, or you'll get your ship capped. It's best in large engagements like this. You saw in this one I led our column into their line, although really their line is a cavalry charge against AI, but I led my ship into that, and despite sailing past 3 or 4 other first, second and third rates, you know, there's barely a scratch on her, to be honest. I've faced a number of broadsides. You do have to be wary of leaks, of course. She does keel like all the ships do, so you've got to be wary of leaks. When you're playing in AI fleets like this, you've got to be the AI loves to play the boarding game. This is a 1 durability ship. If you lose it, it's gone forever and ever and ever. So don't get boarded. Try never to be doing under 3.5 knots. I really plan my turns. Takes quite a while to turn these ships, so I really try and plan my turns. All the gibbering means I've got myself a little bit out of the biff here. You'll see she's super slow. I'm sort of sailing side of the wind here, and would probably do better to tack, so I think I'll do that. So she's super slow. I guess Victory is a bit, for me, underwhelming in the game at the moment because they took her armour away. When she had the armour, for me, she did exactly what she should have been able to do, which was punch against a Santee, not out-punch a Santee, but have a stronger jawline than a Santee. And they've kind of taken that out of the game, and I personally don't like it. I hope they fix that. But great fun in fleeting. Obviously a key ship in port battles for the capital cities. And yeah, that's pretty much the play review. So before I go, you have to remember that the Victory was the exceptional piece of engineering of her day. There was nothing more complicated than building a warship. There was nothing more complicated than building a first of the line, and the Victory was Britain's most powerful and capable ship of the line. After Trafalgar, it was 110 years before a foreign power dared to engage Britain in a fleet battle. The defeat of the French-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar stopped Napoleon in his tracks. He could no longer invade Britain's mainland, and as a result, his designs on capturing Britain were over. It meant that for the next 110 years, and although it sounds very wanky, but it's true, Britain truly did rule the waves. This was to the 19th century Britain as important as the Battle of Britain was against the Third Reich. It was that important in the history of Britain's position in the world. And Nelson's personal sacrifice and the skill of his sailors, the skill of his marines, secured Britain as a naval superpower really until the end of the Second World War, where Britain exhausted herself shipping convoys to and from the New World to try and feed the war machine to defend against the Germans. But for those 150 years or so after Trafalgar, Britain truly did rule the waves, and I think Victory is a figurehead of those times. Their ability to trade anywhere in the world, their ability to sail anywhere in the world, to wage war on 4 continents. These were the outcomes of the Battle of Trafalgar, and it was Victory who led that charge. It was Victory who took the brunt of that battle. And although the ship is amazing, it's the sailors, the engineers, the captains, and the marines that Victory really is the figurehead for a time. I think to close the video off, I'm going to leave it to the real Victory herself. So I hope you enjoyed that. It was long. It was meant to be long. I will catch you on the oceans, and I will see you. And here is Victory herself to say cheerio. Turn your sound up.